Hello friends, today I will tell you the story of a war so short, so strangely dull, that many people laugh when they first hear of it, yet its consequences rippled across the Indian Ocean for decades. It was the morning of the 27th of August 1896, in the sultry port city of Zanzibar, an island once rich with the scent of cloves, the sound of sails, and the shadow of empire. By the end of that morning, smoke would rise over its harbor, a palace would burn, and one sultan's dream would vanish in less than an hour. This is the tale of the most boring war ever, that still changed everything. The island of perfume and power. In the late 19th century, Zanzibar was no ordinary island. It was a jewel of the Indian Ocean, sitting between Africa and Arabia, a bridge between two worlds. Traders from Oman, India, and Africa had passed through its harbors for centuries. The air itself seemed to shimmer with history. Ships from Muscat unloading spices and ivory, Arab merchants in white robes haggling for slaves, British officials in linen suits taking notes and pretending to civilize the place. But behind the bustle and perfume was a growing tension. The British Empire, swollen with pride and greed, had turned its eye toward the East African coast. The Germans were expanding nearby in Tanganyika, and the British wanted Zanzibar as a protectorate. In 1890, through a treaty, Zanzibar had become a British protectorate, though it still had its own sultan, a symbolic ruler with limited power. The man on the throne was Sultan Hamid bin Thuwaini, a quiet, mild-mannered leader who was content to cooperate with the British. But as fate would have it, death was waiting at the palace gates. A death before breakfast. On the morning of the 25th of August 1896, Sultan Hamid bin Thuwaini died suddenly, perhaps of natural causes, perhaps of poison, no one knows. What mattered more was what happened next. Before the British consul could blink, Prince Khalid bin Bargash, Hamid's cousin, seized the palace. He marched in with his guards, sat upon the golden throne, and declared himself the new sultan. The British were furious. You see, the British had their own favorite, Hamoud bin Muhammad, a more obedient man who would agree to every colonial demand. But Khalid? He was proud, ambitious, and uncooperative, a man who dreamed of true independence. By noon that day, British diplomats sent Khalid a message. Greater than, you are not to assume the throne without our approval. Step down immediately. Khalid ignored them. He locked the palace gates, ordered the royal guards to prepare cannons, and hoisted his red royal flag above the rooftops of Zanzibar city. The British now had a problem, and, as always, they preferred to solve problems with gunboats. The Empire sends a message. The British consul in Zanzibar, Basil Cave, wired his superiors. Greater than, Sultan Khalid has taken the palace without permission. Requesting naval support. By the next morning, the harbor was crowded with warships. 5 British vessels lined up in the turquoise waters, their black hulls glinting like steel teeth in the sunlight. Among them were HMS Philomel, HMS Rush, and HMS St. George, flagship of Rear Admiral Harry Rawson. In total, over 1,000 British sailors and marines aimed their guns at a coral stone palace defended by perhaps 2,800 local men, most armed with muskets, a few with small cannons. Inside the palace, Prince Khalid refused to surrender. He sent a defiant reply to the British consul, "We do not recognize your authority." Basil Cave then issued an ultimatum. Greater than, if you are not out of the palace by 9 a.m. on the 27th of August, we shall open fire. The war that lasted 38 minutes. The morning of the 27th was humid and still. The sun rose over the harbor like a burning coin. At 8:55 a.m., the palace courtyard was crowded with Khalid's supporters, soldiers, servants, and curious townsfolk. The Sultan himself stood on the balcony, his robes rippling in the breeze, refusing to flee. At 9 a.m. exactly, the bells of St. Joseph's Cathedral struck 9 times. At 9:02, a puff of white smoke rose from the deck of HMS St. George, the first cannon shot. The shell tore through the palace roof. Then came another, and another. For 38 minutes, the sky above Zanzibar thundered. The palace walls cracked and burned. The royal yacht Glasgow was sunk in the harbor. Fires spread through the bazaar. By 9:40 a.m., the palace was in ruins. Khalid's guards were dead or scattered. The Sultan himself fled through a back door, escaping to the German consulate, where he was granted asylum. The war, if one could call it that, was over. Silence after the storm. When the smoke cleared, 500 Zanzibaris lay dead or wounded. The British? Only one injured sailor. By noon, Sultan Hamoud bin Muhammad, the British favorite, was installed on the throne. A formal protectorate treaty was signed within days. Zanzibar was now, officially and fully, part of the British Empire. It had taken less than an hour. And yet, that hour marked the end of centuries of Arab rule, the end of Zanzibar's independence, and the beginning of a new colonial chapter in East Africa. The boring part that changed the world. To outsiders, the Anglo-Zanzibar War seemed laughable. 38 minutes, scoffed European newspapers? That's not a war. That's a coffee break. But history, my friends, doesn't measure importance by duration. What happened in those 38 minutes was the final cementing of British power in the region. Zanzibar became the empire's strategic stronghold, controlling trade routes from India to Africa. From there, Britain expanded influence along the coast of Kenya and Tanganyika. New anti-slavery laws were enforced under the guise of morality, though mostly to secure trade control. European colonial borders solidified, lines that would later shape modern African nations. A boring war had redrawn the map of East Africa. The forgotten Sultan. As for Sultan Khalid, the man who dared to defy the empire, he lived in exile under German protection for years. When World War I began, the British captured him in East Africa and sent him to Seychelles, then St. Helena, the same island where Napoleon had died. He eventually returned to East Africa, a broken man, and lived out his last days quietly. To some, he was a fool who miscalculated his power. To others, he was the last voice of resistance against imperial rule. History remembers him only as a footnote in The Shortest War Ever. But perhaps he deserved more. Chapter 8. The Lesson Hidden in the Silence. So why, you might ask, call it the most boring war ever? Because no glorious battles were fought. No generals wrote memoirs. No monuments were built. It was over almost before it began. And yet, behind that boredom lies a truth about empire. That sometimes the biggest changes come quietly, under the shadow of cannon smoke, in less than an hour's time. For Zanzibar, those 38 minutes ended centuries of autonomy, rewrote trade, and altered cultures. And for Britain, it was another small victory, one of thousands, that built the illusion of a world under their control. Epilogue. Smoke over the harbor. Today, if you visit Stone Town in Zanzibar, the old palace no longer stands. In its place rises the House of Wonders, partly rebuilt but still scarred by the bombardment. The harbor is calm again, filled not with warships but with fishing boats and ferries carrying tourists. Few remember the morning of August 27, 1896. Yet, when the tide is low and the sea is still, locals say you can hear a faint echo, a cannon blast rolling through time, reminding us of the war that lasted only 38 minutes but changed the destiny of a nation. Hello friends, that was the story of the most boring war ever, that still changed everything. A war of silence, smoke, and empire, where boredom hid the sound of history turning its page.